Honestly, and so we'll move on to our first real item, the Stage 3 drought update. I'm going to get talking sometime. Drought update. Take it away. Ms. Dyer.
All right. Did you want to give any introductory remarks? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Kelly Dyer. I'm the Water Supply Manager, and we have a joint presentation this morning. We're doing something a little bit different than our normal drought update. We are going to be providing a drought condition recap. I will be going into a little background on our drought planning and some of the basis of our policies and management decisions. And we'll go over our updated water supply strategy. And then we'll turn it over to Ms. Wood, our Water Conservation Supervisor, to discuss our demand management strategy. She'll also be giving an overview of water use regulations and what are some options moving forward as the drought continues, assuming it continues for an extended period. And then we will hand it over to Ms. Brooke, who is in our Community Development Department, to discuss water demand from new development. It's really an informational presentation. We're not making any recommendations or taking any actions at this point, but it's information for the Water Commission to know how much water is being used by new development, and then also how much water could be saved with additional water use restrictions. So our rain totals for the current water year, which this is the county's water year starting September 1st, we're at about 0.18 inches at Gibraltar Reservoir, 0.21 inches at Kachuma, and 1 inch in downtown Santa Barbara. And so it's just the beginning of the water year. We get most of our rainfall and inflows to our reservoirs in the January through March period, but this is somewhat of a nice start to at least have something on the books. NOAA forecasts a chance of a weak El Nino developing during the fall and winter. And so I'm not going to speculate whether that means anything to us at this point, but at least it's not showing dry conditions. That our area, they're forecasting for the next 3 months equal chances of above normal or below normal conditions. So we'll see what happens. We're planning for continued drought. And this is the current drought monitor that's prepared by federal agencies. And our area continues to be categorized as a severe drought. But you can see the rest of the state is looking pretty dry now as well. And then just to recap where we've been, back in 2014, we declared the Stage 2 drought condition with a 20% reduction in demands that was required. And then a year later, in May of 2015, we went to a Stage 3 drought emergency with 25% demand reduction. The following year, in spring of 2016, we amended that to be a 35% reduction. And then in the winter of 2017, we were forecasting some shortages for the summertime peak demands. We had enough water supplies that year, but we had some capacity limitations and couldn't get the water here to meet peak demands. So we implemented the lawn ban to try and shave off those summer peak demands. Fortunately, that spring of 2017, we did receive some help from Mother Nature, and we had some inflows to both Gibraltar and Kachuma, so we were able to, be given that our supply condition had improved, we revised the demand reduction to be 30%, and that's what it continues to be today. So just some background on our drought planning. This was, I can't emphasize enough, it's so important to have a plan before you go into an emergency. And we had just updated our long-term water supply plan in 2011. So it was really the last time Kachuma was spilling was when we finished our plan. And that plan showed in the long term a couple of key themes were that we would keep our water demands down through strong conservation. And when you look at that plan, we really show our demands going down over time despite increases in population. And it was based on the worst drought of record, which at the time was 1947 to 52. That's now the second worst drought because what we just experienced was much drier. And we also had a water shortage contingency plan, which outlines the 3 stages of drought. We have planned demand reductions, and we have some policies on how we achieve those planned demand reductions that are outlined in our water shortage contingency plan. And we also had desalination reactivation as a way to address our water shortage. So just a summary of how we manage our supplies during droughts. Our groundwater supplies is reserved for droughts and emergencies. So we do increase our pumping during droughts, then we let the basin recover and rest through what's called in-lieu recharge during wet periods. And we increase our imported water through the State Water Project. When our state water allocations have been less than 100%, we've been purchasing supplemental water in order to keep the pipe flowing full to Kachuma. And then we have planned demand reductions, and those are achieved through rate adjustments. Most of our revenue is volumetric charges, and so when we have demand reductions, we need to make adjustments to our water rates. We have water use regulations as needed, and we enhance our public outreach. And then finally, desalination as well. So the chart on the left is from our long-term water supply plan that was done in 2011. And on the right shows what we've actually experienced over the last 7 years. And so I wanted to just highlight a few key differences. One being that it's an additional year. Second, the amount of surface water that we've received in this drought has been much less than what was planned. We've had significant cutbacks in our supplies from Kachuma and Gibraltar, and that's because we really had no inflows to the lake. And as a result of having those significant cutbacks, we've had to experience demand reductions of 20 to 40% in this drought compared to the policy in our drought planning of up to 15% planned demand reductions. So I can't say enough about how wonderful it's been that our community has really helped us in managing this drought by meeting our demand reduction targets. We've had the driest consecutive 7 years in recorded history, and we've had to adapt to those conditions. Although how we've managed the drought is consistent with our planning policies and our long-term water supply plan. So our water supply strategy currently, which I'll be introducing on the next slide, now that our original planning horizon of 6 years has passed, we're now planning for the next 3 years. So now we've got a 10-year planning period. And in our projections, we assume no additional inflows to Gibraltar or Kachuma. And we also assume that we would continue to purchase supplemental water to keep our state water pipeline flowing full. We also have updated the strategy based on our new groundwater projections that came out of the recent report from USGS, which was a sustainable yield of our groundwater basins. The new projections do show additional supply to us available, assuming that we would allow seawater intrusion to occur up to the 101. That's the sort of the cutoff point. Our previous projections that we'd been using for our planning assumed no seawater intrusion at all. So this is our current supply strategy. The numbers for actual water supplies through 2018 are all have been updated. So we're currently now in year 8 of the drought and projecting for the next 3 years. Our shortage out in 2021 is about 850 acre feet. We think that's a manageable amount, and so we're not recommending any actions to address that shortage right now. If a lot of conservative assumptions in our supply projections, and things could change. So we'll wait to see what happens with this winter and reassess this coming spring of 2019 where we're at. And unless there's any questions, I'll turn it over to Ms. Wood.
Questions on this section?
No, I just have one little comment, just a question about the seawater intrusion and basically letting it go up to 101. And again, I'm going to report a little bit later about sea level rise, and it just made me think about the fact that we haven't talked at all about if we let seawater intrusion come up here, now sea levels rise, that sea level water intrusion is going to go further inland even then. So it it's on. Pull it a little closer. They're calling. Anyway, you got my gist. It's really more of a comment than a question, because I had always understood essentially trying to hold it down there at Chase Palm Park, not let it go up to the freeway. And I guess as a follow-up question, do we have any plans on how you combat seawater intrusion in terms of infusing water into the ground?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Davis, yes. Well, let me first say we've taken a conservative approach by assuming some of our wells would not be operating in our supply projection. So we're not fully utilizing the entire yield that was put forth in the USGS report. In terms of combating seawater intrusion and pushing it back out, historically we have just done that through in lieu recharge by not using our groundwater wells when we don't need to in normal and wet circumstances. However, we have been looking at a pilot project to be able to inject treated surface water into our groundwater basins to have some artificial recharge and increase storage that would then push the seawater out faster. We're holding off on that pilot project until Kachuma storage is up at higher levels, since we'd right now would be using our Kachuma storage to meet demands instead of injecting into the ground.
Great, thank you.
Go ahead.
Could you put the last slide up that shows the 2021? So in 2021, it shows the state water percentage or allocation. Is there a percentage of that's a table A, I assume? And is that a full allocation? Is it a partial? Because we've gone down to 0 in the past couple of years. So what percentage are you factoring in on that?
Councilmember Freeman, we're assuming our Table A allocation will be 35% going forward for the next 3 years, and that we would have to buy supplemental purchases for the remaining 65% of our capacity. So the orange bar is the supplemental purchases, and the green bar is our 35% state water allocation.
Okay, and so we could... through supplemental water purchases, we might, if we got to this point, we could actually go above where that orange is. Because my understanding, we're on the Central Coast Water Authority, they're working on amending the whole state water contract to allow agencies like ours to change how we can purchase supplemental water, which will make it easier to get. So that orange bar could go up, assuming that these changes go through?
Councilmember Freeman, that's a good point. I think what will happen with those amendments is the amount of water that we would plan on won't change, but we wouldn't have any exchange component in those water purchases. They could be outright purchases, so we wouldn't accrue any additional debt on our how much water is owed back. I think our current debt owed to AVAC is around 3,000 acre feet or so, and so we could pursue supplemental water without accruing any further water debt.
Thank you.
So I just have a couple comments too, and one's on that graph, and it's easier for me to explain to somebody who doesn't sit here once a month that red block is really on top of the brown block, because that's really what you're talking about. You're talking about the prior year 10,500 acre feet being reduced to 850 acre feet less. Mm-hmm. And so the additional conservation has a direct connection to that prior year's bar, right? I know we've always done it this way, which always seems to be one of my comments is, what the heck? But it's easier to explain that you're not just actually burdening me with extra conservation, but why, if it's down next to that higher bar and the second one in. Does that make sense?
So maybe for optics, you're suggesting putting the red bar below the white bar so it's close to the green?
Yep.
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, just a thought. And then my other comment was on that graph with the side-by-side reports like that with the surface water line. That's the best graph you've ever used, okay, in my lifetime. Okay. Because you see these things and you go, whatever, and you see the bars go up and down and you don't quite figure it out. But when you see the comparison on the past drought to this drought, or whatever it was, the comparison of surface water and the huge reduction of incoming surface water, and why that gets me off the soapbox with you every month on groundwater pumping, right? Because then you can see a clear nexus on why groundwater pumping just exploded compared to the prior set of graphs. It makes sense, right? So I think it's if you can keep that one coming, that's a great one to keep showing.
Okay, thank you.
Let's move on.
I had a question too.
Sorry?
I mimic your comment about the red bar. I've always wanted to see it down at the bottom too. But I had a question on the water purchases. Is that the maximum we could purchase based on our pipeline capacity, or?
That's correct, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Kilborn. That's correct. It's based on the city's portion of the capacity. In the past, you can see back in 2015, we were able to utilize other agencies' portion of the pipeline capacity, because not every CCWA member was sending their state water to Kachuma. Now that we're farther into the drought, everyone's using their capacity. So I don't think there's as much opportunity for using other member agencies' portion of the pipe.
Chair Jordan, members of the Water Commission, my name is Madeline Wood. I'm the Water Conservation Supervisor, and I'll be going through a few slides about our demand management strategy and water use regulations. There we go. Compared to 2013 pre-drought water production, we had a 27% reduction in water use for the month of September. And this continues our 12-month running average reduction of 30%, which is the target that we've set for the community. In terms of our demand management strategy to meet that 30% water conservation target citywide, we have a number of water use regulations that are enforced during any year. And in drought years, we have additional drought water use regulations. Just to name a few, we have regulations on the time of day for watering, for large fountains, for hosing off pavement, and more. Drought water rates are also in effect, and these are based on the 30% conservation target and are currently adopted through fiscal year 2020. And we have enhanced public outreach through messaging, increased services, advertising, workshops, and more. For additional water use regulations, there may be several triggers. If the citywide demand reduction target is not met, if there are water supply interruptions or situations in which we may have enough water but conveyance capacity limitations to deliver it here, and at times new state regulations have triggered new or modified city regulations. Currently, the State Water Resources Control Board has removed the city's 12% conservation standard and for all water suppliers statewide. So at this time, we do not foresee additional statewide drought regulations, but we continue to monitor these discussions. The phased water use regulations that we've previously discussed with Water Commission and Council include a prohibition on watering lawns. And just to note, we don't have data on how much water is specifically going to lawns in our service area. So, because our meters generally count for all water on a property. So we had to make some assumptions, which is why you'll see a range in the estimated water savings on this slide. So the estimated savings of a lawn watering ban are 500 to 1,100 acre-feet per year. Prohibiting outdoor water use, except for hand watering of trees and shrubs. The rough estimate of savings for that is 1,200 to 1,600 acre-feet per year. And a total prohibition on outdoor water use has a rough estimate of 1,600 to 2,000 acre-feet per year. And before I turn it over to Ms. Brooke, I wanted to mention that we do have water conservation requirements for the development projects that come through the city. In terms of indoor water use, the city adopted and enforces the minimum indoor water use requirements of the California Green Building Standards Code, and this code is the most efficient in the nation. And the city also has landscape design standards for irrigation and landscaping, which are more restrictive than the state standards. And now I'll turn it over to Ms. Brooke.
Thank you, Commissioners. I'm happy to be here to help in this presentation. And as you're hearing from your staff, from the Water Resources staff, as we continue into a prolonged drought, it's fair to ask the question about how much does new development demand from our water supply each year. And we had several presentations and with the City Council and discussions with the Planning Commission back in 2015 and 2016, as well as your commission, on the same topic. And at that time, City Council did not implement any restrictions on new development due to the small amount of overall water demand that new development requires. And you'll be hearing the same from me again today. I'll give you some updated statistics on that. So when the city updated our general plan in 2011, with that we had a program EIR that went with that and analyzed the environmental impacts of the projected growth over a 20-year period that the general plan covers. So this first column you see here, water use from new development estimated per that Plan Santa Barbara EIR, was with all the new development that we projected over the 20-year period, we estimated that it would add 40 acre-feet per year. And that represents, under our current drought water supply amount, would be 0.38% of overall water demand. What we've seen over the last 14 years is actually less water demand than is projected in the EIR. We've averaged about 26 acre-feet per year of new water demand as a result of new development, which is 0.24% of the overall demand under current water supply assumptions. And then these next few slides break down in a little bit more of a micro scale estimated water demand from development. This current slide shows development under construction and divides it by land use, with a total of 94 acre-feet per year for all new development under construction. And it's important to know that not all of that comes online at once. Construction projects can take a prolonged period of time. So we wouldn't expect this all to come on in the next year. It's probably over the next couple years that we would see this come on. And then estimated potential water demand from all development in the pipeline is what we call it, but it's projects that are either approved through a land use discretionary process or might even have a building permit but aren't yet under construction. That's estimated about 97 acre-feet per year. And then pending projects are not yet approved. They could range from somebody who just submitted an application yesterday to projects. Some of these projects that are represented in the pending line have been in our system since even before 2007, but they've been able to maintain their life through extensions of the Tentative Subdivision Map Act and other various reasons that they're still counted in our pending category. And we, over the last, well, at least 20 years or so, we tend to find that only about a third of the projects that are pending actually become realized and on the ground and constructed. So I just want to add those caveats, because even though these are small numbers relative to the overall water demand, these are in some cases a worst case scenario for the near term future, at least what we would expect for new development to come online and the water demands they would have. And with those, total would be approximately 214 acre feet per year. And again, this would be metered out over several years as they go through the process to get permits and under construction. And then just to keep in perspective, we've been keeping a running average of all new development and the water demand that it has brought online each year since at least 2004. Our 14-year average is, as I mentioned earlier, 26 acre feet per year. I will note that so far this year, from January to August, we have put online development that has demanded 38 acre feet per year. So this year already is proving to require more demand than the last 3 previous years, but still, when averaged over time, is in line with generally what we would expect, and still would fall below our assumptions in the general plan EIR for overall growth.
Question, Mr. Chair. Renee, you keep saying 26 acre feet a year. That's the average. So you're really talking 26 acre feet a year per year.
Yes.
Just to clarify, because it's
correct.
It is cumulative.
You're right.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
And that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions about that.
Did I prompt you, Renee, for to chat on a couple? Well, I just heard you say one, and I just want to have you reinforce that a little bit, because it's also it's in the report later today for Planning Commission and next week. But despite the perceived explosion, let's say, of AUD and now ADU projects, even with that, when you there's actually a reduction this year over last year in development, but when you look at those and projecting out for the lifetime of the general plan, we're still actually running at less development units than we predicted in the general plan, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
And I can give you specifics if you want to know, but yes.
But somebody else can. And then,
Actually,
so let's come back to that. And then the other thing I'd like you to hear you talk about a little bit about, because everybody always focuses on the numbers and not the social or community impacts. And so maybe if you could talk a little bit after you answer that question for Dave on what those potential impacts are to replacement of old buildings not being replaced, to housing being provided, and economic stimulation that would go away versus the pretty small number of acre feet usage. Okay, thanks.
Certainly. So thank you, Chair Jordan. In terms of specifics and the numbers, our general plan assumed over the life of the 20-year, its 20-year life, that we would potentially see 140 new residential units per year, and we've seen an average that is closer to 98 units per year. So we are producing less housing on average over the life of the general plan so far, less than we expected. Now, granted, we have years where there are peaks and we have more production, but it's very cyclical. And so we like to look at averages over longer periods of time, because we know that there's also down periods too. So we are producing less units.
And we did have a peak last year.
We did.
Right, but we're already below average again this year, correct?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
And the reason I was interested, because we're going to be looking at the long-term water supply plan, and the general plan is now over a decade old, I think, 205 plus or minus. If this is the new normal in terms of water supply, basically whether we needed to revisit the projected general plan projections on housing units and water demand when we get to the long-term water supply plan. So again, I'm sure you guys at the Planning Commission will be addressing that, but that's why I thought it'd be interested to hear the actual numbers. So thank you.
Well, and on that, I will say, you mentioned accessory dwelling units and AUD units. It's interesting in the last year, really, the accessory dwelling units have added much more to our unit count as AUDs have sort of stagnated.
Yeah.
So it's just a different type of housing unit we've seen come online in the last year, and I think that would continue going forward too, at least through 2018 and probably into early 2019.
And then if you just share a few thoughts, because I know when this goes to council, this is exactly what they consider. They don't just look at the numbers, they also consider the community impacts on social stuff like housing and economic stimulation and lack of housing and that kind of stuff. So maybe you could just share a little bit how it's not
Right.
just looking at numbers and adding 42 acre feet on a piece of paper per year.
That's true, and thank you. And you covered really the highlights of what we've discussed with council in the past. Not only would we not recommend development restrictions because specifically due to the low percentage of water demand that it actually requires, but I can only speak anecdotally because I don't have hard statistics in front of me, but we are working on trying to nail that down a little bit more, the economic impacts of stalling development or putting restrictions on development. But certainly our general plan and our housing element is full of policies of encouraging additional housing development. And so if we were in a position where we needed to make tough decisions about development restrictions, I think we'd have to get into specifics about, is it housing, is it non-residential, is it affordable housing, but I don't think we're there yet. And I hope to have some more quantified information to be able to discuss at the time that this goes to City Council about other impacts that development restrictions could have.
Other questions? Mr. Friedman.
I just want to appreciate you raising that question about what we consider at the council as the whole big picture.
Hope I wasn't speaking incorrectly.
You're not.
Okay.
You're fine. It's actually what we consider. I just wanted to add another layer of complexity to this when we talk about development is that the state has decided that due to the affordable housing crisis throughout the state, they are bringing in a lot of new regulations that basically take away a lot of local control. So we have to plan for trying to maintain as much local control within our purview so that the state doesn't just come in and do a cookie-cutter approach. So that's the other balance that we're trying to achieve, because I know there's a lot of people out there that are asking, well, why don't you just stop development now because we're in this drought? Well, it's not that easy because the state is doing a lot of different bills. It's constantly changing that we have to consider as well. So to your point, Mr. Jordan, it is a big comprehensive approach that we're taking for those types of reasons.
Go ahead.
Thank you for coming and presenting. Just a couple language things. As the Water Commission, we don't decide on community development policies, which is appropriate. But I did hear both in your presentation and in the written report, it talks about a worst case scenario of building out to the general plan. And it's my understanding the general plan really has approved appropriate and necessary growth. So it's, if I'm the person who can't live in Santa Barbara because I don't have a house, or if I'm the person trying to build a business and can't get a permit, that's not a worst case scenario for me. Mm-hmm. So I would just suggest maybe changing that to maximum or something a little less. Yeah. And then the other one is actually for the water staff. Several times, I guess it's also in the development part, we talk about a normal water year as using 14,600 acre feet per year. It's both in the council agenda report for the stage 3 update as well as the analysis of water use development. It actually starts with that in a normal water year. I think we should change that. That's actually, I don't think we're in a water year. I don't think we live in a world anywhere where we can use almost 15,000 acre feet of water, even if it rains. We've got the biological opinion coming up. There's just so many uncertainties, and even if we get a good water year, we might automatically go into another drought year, and we shouldn't be using 15,000 acre feet when we know very well that our community can sustain itself on so much less. So I don't know if we want to call it a historical average or a pre-drought average, but I don't think we should call it normal anymore.
I think the pre-drought is probably the most appropriate term for it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. So, presumably the new development incorporates all the water conservation measures, both indoors and outdoors. Do you track to some extent what, from the metering and all that, whether that results in a significant difference between traditional, or the historical use per capita versus what you have in those new developments? It is in a way, but doesn't tell us per capita comparative to the other ones. Just to see, I think it would be good messaging eventually if there's a significant difference. So that's another argument to talk about.
Commissioner Keller, I'm not sure that we've done that. We could, but just to clarify, the numbers that I've presented are our estimated water demand from new development. We use water demand factors based on the number of units, type of. So that's. But it's net new, so it does take into account what was on the site before, and then what was being developed. But it's gross, and it takes into account all the projects for the year. Right.
No, my point was, and I get it, that this is estimated, and it's great to have that estimated. It'd be good to see actual, given that now they've been built. You have a record of how many have been built. Whether that conservation measures are really working and so
right
better than the other ones, the traditional.
And that's a great point you bring up, because it's often surprising to the public how little water use new development does demand, but it's in large part because new plumbing fixtures, landscape conservation standards, all that changing over with the redevelopment really keeps the water use pretty low.
And Commissioner Keller, just one more point, if I'm not mistaken, the water demand factor is for full occupancy, and often it takes many years for these projects to have full occupancy. So I think what we would see, at least for the first initial years of a meter, would be trending lower than what was estimated, but we can definitely dig into that.
Anybody else? Okay. Thank you, Renee. Is there anything else on this item? All right. We'll move on. Thank you all.